And now I think I can turn it over to Tom Wecko, one of my colleagues here at the George Washington University Institute of Public Policy, who will be moderating this discussion.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. So today we have a great opportunity to hear from two people who've thought and written quite a bit about the shape of the federal government's role in higher education and lifelong learning data. Mark Schneider, former colleague of mine, NCES commissioner from 2004 through 2008, vice president at AIR, American Institutes for Research, from 2008 through 2018, and from 2018 to 2024, director of the Institute of Education Sciences. Mark is now the non-resident senior fellow. I guess that means he doesn't go to the office. He's now the non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he has a prominent voice in making arguments about the future of the federal government's role in education data. We're joined as well by Mamie Voight, who is the president and the CEO of the Institute for Higher Education Policy. She joined the organization in 2013, and so has been there for the previous dozen years. Prior to that, she served as a researcher with the Education Trust, and among the more interesting backgrounds of our people in the meeting today, she started her career as a civil engineer and as a transportation engineering consultant and expert. I've asked Mamie and Mark if they would speak briefly today before we open to a wider set of discussion and questions around a few basic questions. And the questions I've invited them to address include, what did the Department of Education, and specifically NCES, what has it gotten right and wrong in meeting this responsibility to create and disseminate data on higher education and lifelong learning and skills that's sufficient to meet the needs of policymakers and educators and the public? What did it get right and wrong in its role as an investor in the development of state data systems? And I think really most importantly, where do we go from here? How does the federal government ensure that the legitimate needs of policymakers and educators and advocates and researchers and the wider public are being met? So Mark, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off and sharing some of your thoughts about those questions, we'd welcome that.
Okay, well, thank you.
Sure.
So Tom knows me well enough. I think many people. So Tom asked me very specifically to focus on what NCS and the department got right and wrong with regard to lifelong learning and higher education, but I am actually going to talk about a broader set of concerns. And look, the problems that I'm going to note with regard to NCS and IAS affected the way in which they collected data on everything, including the higher education and work. I'm sorry, since it's not clear what if it exists anymore, it was a venerable and valuable organization, but like almost everything else in IES needed a serious rethink about its practices and its products. So let me talk about some of the fundamental problems that plagued NCS and why I'm not overly distraught about the fact that it, like most of IES, ended up being hit on the head with a sledgehammer. I think it needed it, but the question then is, of course, is like what happens tomorrow is really the real issue. So I have met with many people, in the department, outside the department, and everybody's sort of waiting for the Department of Education to stand up and say, this is what we need with regard to a modern R&D infrastructure, education R&D infrastructure. This is what we need for a modern statistical agency, because the sad part is that neither IES nor NCES were modern and were conforming to best practices. So here are some examples. So one of the biggest, if not the biggest problem, which was totally endemic to NCES, which is a contract, which was, I'm going to keep going back and forth between is and was, present and past. But IAS, and especially NCES, was a contract agency. That's the fact of the matter, right? It had 100 people, and almost all of them were involved in contract management. So this is a problem that I think exists throughout the federal government, but certainly I experienced it in NCES and IAS. And this is extreme vendor preference. By the way, this is illegal and can be very costly to the American taxpayer. So one of the most salutary examples was we hired McKinsey to come in to take a look at our practices and to try to modernize our system. This is like within the first year that I was there as director. And one of the senior program officers, remember, a senior program officer talking to an external consultant said, "You will have to pry this contract out of my dead hands." I mean, this tells you there's something wrong with people's heads when they're willing to say something that's patently illegal to an outside consultant. For NCS, for me, the biggest culprit was ETS and NAEP. So essentially, ETS got the contract from ECS 40 years ago, and essentially no competition ever since. So the very system of NAEP, plausible values, little or no feedback to schools, is pretty much incomprehensible to anybody who didn't grow up in that system. Yesterday, 2 days ago, there was a meeting between ETS, NCS, and DOGE. And this meeting was critically important because DOGE had the, shall we say, the independence to not be dissuaded by the usual smoke and mirrors that NCS blew with regard to hiding years of overcharging the American taxpayer and terrible contracting. ETS, quite frankly, left suitably humbled. I wish I had the power to make them feel suitably humbled, but I did not, in part because because of the structural relationship between NCS and IAS. But I believe that the external force of DOGE is actually forcing NCS to, because every one of its contracts has been canceled, to think thoroughly and carefully about their contracts and whether or not they can be modernized. So with regard to ETS, they were told, yeah, you won that contract, but you're going to have to cut 40% or 60% or 50%. Part of the problem is that the target for the cuts keeps moving. But the fact of the matter is that NCS is being forced to rethink all its contracts because extreme vendor preference made the contracting process and the contracts not, shall we say, not modern. Second problem was the lack of timeliness. So when there was the possibility of Ezra, et cetera, area being reauthorized 2 years ago, I was able to insert into the reauthorization language the importance of timeliness, and this was aimed, quite frankly, at NCS. So the biggest problem was the indicator problem, let's call it this way. It was the lack of timeliness in reporting school level fiscal data, right? This was years behind. This was mandated by law, and NCS never, they were 3 years behind, and they never reported the school level data, even though they said they did. If they did, I was never able to find it. So the lack of timeliness is one of the most serious problems that affected the data collection all up and down and across the board for NCS. And related to that is that there's just there was way too much reliance on old ways of doing business. It was, I mean, the NCS said we've been doing this, they claim to be the oldest federal statistical agency, BLS and NCS debate over what year they were really started and whether or not NCS is really the continuous as it was dating back to 1860s. So the conservatism, which I'm a conservative, I believe conservatism is important, but not to the extent to which it freezes everything and stops modernization. So I want to just go back to the school level fiscal data. It took years for NCS to, if ever, to collect and report these data. Marguerite Rose, using much more modern data techniques, reports school level fiscal data within months. The longitudinal data systems, which in some ways, including the post-secondary ones, which are in some ways the most important products that NCS does, right? These were the crown jewels in NCS in 1970. They were created in response to the Coleman report, but we're now, 50 years, 55 years past that, and they just keep running on autopilot. There's been great hesitation about revisiting the balance between surveys and administrative data and protecting the longitudinal data systems, which is important, became too important, if you will. SLDS. So for me, SLDS is a fundamentally important program, but again, it's mired in past practices and outdated concepts of data collection. So it was passed in 2005. I actually signed the first two rounds of about $500 million worth of SLDS grants. And in the first round, I lost an incredibly important fight when I was trying to insist that SLDS programs had to have a user component to it. And anyway, Tom knows who opposed that. But I was not able to get the user requirement in the first round. The second round, there was a little bit of attention to user, and then in subsequent rounds, the user became more important. But SLDS is a state program, and the states own the data. So we have to remember that. But the way in which SLDS is set up makes no sense in a modern world. So we should be supporting states to build and use more modern and far cheaper design and build strategies. So here's the fundamental question. Why does every state get money every 3 years to build their own systems? So it's like, do we expect users to reinvent and perfect and implement their own word processing systems or their own Excel? No. The way in which modern technology works is you build once and use it over and over again. And you design the system in a way that the core is common across all users, but the end caps, if you will, like if you go into Walmart, the 80% of the stock is identical and the end caps change. So, you don't sell winter clothing, you don't sell Canada Goose jackets in Louisiana, right? So the end caps are regionalized for that store and that market. But 80% of the market, 80% of the things in the state, in the store are identical. So we should be building one system that 80% of the states could use, 80% of what's in that one system is going to be common across all the states. And there should be enough flexibility for individualization in the end caps. My guess is that rather than spending $35 million a year, we could build something once and update it. Probably, well, it depends on which system we buy and who does it, but it would be a fraction of the cost, right? So it's $35 million a year now. Probably for $20 million, we could build a system that would be improved or customized, but it would not cost anywhere near the amount of money. And by the way, this to me is a new insight, because when we were doing the area renewal And when we were talking about the NEED Act, and again, most of you probably know what I'm talking about, I was arguing for $1 billion for SLDS. And I was wrong, because I think the modern technologies are such that we could actually do everything we want from SLDS, and that we could, in fact, do that for a fraction of the cost. The last thing I want to talk about is about OMB and OIRA's trust regs. Again, I understand this is like really weedy stuff, but it's really, really important. So OIRA is buried deep in the bowels of OMB. They have many roles, but one of the most important roles is to protect the federal statistical system. So they put out a draft of trust regs that essentially would have turned NCES and other federal statistical agencies into independent actors, even though they're housed in parent agencies. OIRA's draft was strongly opposed by the Department of Education officials, and this is under the Biden administration. So it's not just Trump. This was the Biden administration opposed it, and Treasury, state, and other powerful agencies all opposed it, because what they realized was that giving the kinds of power that OIRA wanted to give to the federal statistical agencies were going to make them almost ungovernable by the parent organization. So OMB was supported, OIRA was supported by other federal statistical agencies, and the statistics blob. The American Statistical Association was most notable, and they published a final rule with only minor concessions to the interest of the parent agencies that house statistical units. So NCS always wanted to be independent, right? I mean, that's what we need to always remember. And OIRA did everything it could to push that forward. And that would have made the relationship between NCS and IES even more difficult than it was. The trust regs, obviously, NCS has 3 people left in it. So the trust regs are pretty much meaningless at this time. I have advocated for using the Congressional Review Act to get rid of them. But I think there's so many other things going on right now, obviously, in the federal government that, the CRA for this trust regs not making the cut. So let me just conclude.
Okay.
So NCS has been a valuable organization that I believe got extremely rusty, right? I mean, it just fell further and further behind. I think it suffered from weak leadership. I think that that modernization was not in its DNA, and as a result, I think it engaged in terrible contracting processes, and contracting is core to what NCS does.
Okay, I'm going to just go to Mamie in a second. I'm going to take the privilege of saying 3 things, having worked at NCES as an associate commissioner under your leadership. 1, Thomas Kuhn, in writing his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, said, progress happens one funeral at a time. So, I mean, the problem is that if you had given a cohort of 20 data scientists to NCES, it would have sort of really started to change the intellectual atmosphere there. Part of the problem goes back to resourcing and staffing levels of organizations like that, and the levels of turnover and currency of skills I think you're able to obtain. So I think that creates a lot of inertia. And the other part of the problem is Congress, right? I mean, Jesus, HEOA was last reauthorized in 2008. Ezra never got reauthorized. So there's a lot of inertia introduced by the breakdown of the reauthorizing process to really make some substantial changes to the organizations. And I think the other thing I would say, having been there, is that, as the American Statistical Association pointed out, the staffing levels relative to the spend levels and the statistical remit of NCS was distinctively small. And I think, in my experience, that did introduce an enormous dependence of staff on contractors, because there weren't the sort of the people and the skills in-house to do the kind of thinking and guiding that should have been done. I mean, those are all sort of adverse circumstances. And whatever happens in future with the statistical agency, those are things worth thinking about. But later on, I want to have you talk about where we go from here, because that's a really important problem, right? I mean, it's okay to say kind of where we were. Mamie, what are your thoughts about the role of NCES and the Department of Education as a provider of data to policymaking in DC and the wider world?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tom, for that introduction. And Mark, it's good to be alongside you here for this conversation. Tom, I think in short, to answer that question around the role of NCES, I think it has a critically important role in policy development, in research within the education space. And just for those of you who I don't have the pleasure of knowing yet, I want to give you a bit of background about IHEP, because it really grounds kind of how we enter this space and this conversation about the future of IES. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research, policy, and advocacy organization, and we are working towards building a more just and equitable society through higher education. So core to all of our work that we do is research, a reliance on quality data to build evidence-based insights that we can provide to policymakers, to practitioners, ultimately to improve student outcomes. And because we have this really central focus on data and realize how crucial quality data are to educational improvement, we also lead an initiative called the Postsecondary Data Collaborative. And I see several participants in the POSSEC data on the call here as well. Together as POSSEC data, we advocate for the collection and responsible use of high quality post-secondary data. So all of that grounding in post-secondary data, both as active users of NCES data and conveners of people within the data use community, that all brings us into this conversation. And I know that the big question you want to get to here, Tom, is where we go from here. Yeah. But before I get to that, I think I would just be remiss if I didn't start out here by expressing the grave concerns I have with the arbitrary and abrupt and deeply damaging cuts that have happened to both staffing and contracts at IES. And I know that I'm not alone in these concerns. We had nearly 90 organizations and researchers sign on to a letter to Congress calling for action, swift action, to provide greater oversight over what is happening at IES, what has happened at IES, because these cuts that have happened are the absolute opposite of efficiency. They happened and they were executed with no real plan to rebuild, and they stopped the work that was already partially completed, in some cases almost entirely completed. So that means that taxpayer dollars are going to be wasted here, and taxpayers will receive no benefit for those dollars that already have been spent. All of this, these cuts, they put IES data at real risk, and that includes statutorily mandated functions. Tom, you mentioned HEOA, which has requirements in it that IES must fulfill, and all of those are now at risk. So we can talk about rebuilding, but I want to make sure that we start off here with how this enormous intellectual capital has already been lost from the agency, and that's going to make the rebuild here that much more difficult. And in the meantime, the field is facing real-time damage in terms of the availability of data. You know, I've heard the analogy here used of a bulldozer being brought to IES. Mark, you mentioned a sledgehammer being brought to it. And that's exactly what the administration did. They brought a bulldozer to these critical data. But Tom, you also mentioned my background in engineering. And so I know that in construction, you don't bulldoze a building before you've drafted the blueprints to rebuild that building until you have the funding secured to rebuild that building. Otherwise, you're just left with a big hole in the ground. And that's what we're facing right now with the eliminations that have happened. So I don't want to undercut how severe this damage has been. Now, Tom, part of what you have asked also is what NCES got right with post-secondary education. And I think there's a pretty short answer to that one as well. And it's gotten a lot right. Are there opportunities for improvement? Yes. Like with any agency, there are opportunities for improvement. But NCES has done a lot of good, and the field relies heavily on the data from NCES. And I'm going to focus mostly here on the post-secondary data because that's where IHEP really, the space where we really sit. And I'll give just a couple examples of what NCES does here. They oversee the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, IPEDS. I think many people on the call are very familiar with IPEDS. One of the benefits of IPEDS is that it is comprehensive. It includes data on all Title IV institutions nationwide, and that's something that only the federal government can do because the federal government has the authority to link Title IV aid to an institution reporting these data. So as we think about a redesign, this is one of the crucial reasons to keep these statistical functions within the federal government because the federal government has that authority. And IPEDS, as a result, it provides really thorough and comparable data that can answer questions around access and affordability and completion and so much more. And students rely on this information to make decisions about where to go to college. NCES also leads the post-secondary sample studies, which Mark mentioned as well. In the post-secondary space, the key ones right now are the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study, NCES, as well as BPS, the Beginning Post-Secondary Students Longitudinal Study. And both of these are crucial elements of the national data infrastructure. They're large, they're nationally representative studies, and they provide really important insights about enrollment and degree completion, student finances, and because they have the student survey component, they're able to offer insights about student experiences that aren't available anywhere else. These studies have improved in terms of leaning on FAFSA administrative data to fill in a number of the financial aid components, and so that's been a modernization that has happened over time. But NCES, they don't just collect these data and sort of leave them be locked up in a box. They make them easily accessible and usable for free to the higher ed community through tools like Data Lab, the IPEDS Data Center, restricted use data files that allow for more sophisticated data analysis. And they also are made available and used within Department of Ed tools, things like the College Scorecard. And they serve as the basis for a number of privately developed tools that help with the college search process or other purposes. Even Google relies upon IPEDS data in its search results for institutions. So they really serve as the backbone for our education data infrastructure. And then to give you a flavor of the type of insights that can be derived from these studies, to show that they really are relevant and applicable to today's context. Just recently, the GAO, they used NCES data to study student eligibility for and take-up of means-tested benefits like SNAP. And they found through this analysis of NCES data that 60% of students who appeared to be eligible for SNAP were not receiving these benefits. So that's a finding with really direct policy implications for outreach to students, communications to students about their eligibility for these benefits. Similarly, we've seen research from researchers like Susan Dynarski and Judith Scott Clayton about FAFSA simplification. And again, they use NCES data to inform efforts by Congress to take a look at the complexity within the FAFSA and understand with their findings that the students who were most negatively impacted by the complexity were those who were least able to afford college. And they identified that the FAFSA could be shortened to just a few questions. And this fed into the then Senator Lamar Alexander's efforts to simplify the FAFSA. These data are also useful for states and institutions. We, as a result of the FAFSA simplification, had a shift from the EFC to the Student Aid Index. And states were sitting with how they could then put together their budget estimates and their budget justifications for their own state budgets, given the change here that was happening. And so because they had some challenges with their state longitudinal data system's ability to actually model out this scenario and this shift, SHIO stepped in and they used NCES data again to model the impacts for 30 different states and provide these states with the data they needed to then make budget estimates for their own state budgets. So I promised I would get to thinking about the future here. And so as we look towards the future of NCES and IES, I think that we need to keep in mind a few key principles here. The first one is that we need to ensure that the best parts of NCES are maintained. Those things are related to statistical rigor, public transparency, data security and privacy protections that are held very strongly within IES, data accessibility, and responsiveness to stakeholder input. And then second, these data need to be housed within the federal government. And I raised a couple of pieces related to that earlier, but I think it's worth pointing out some ways in which states and private entities simply cannot perform these functions the way that the federal government does. And that's not a philosophical debate. There are some very practical reasons here about why the federal government is best situated to do this. One is that they have the authority to mandate reporting from colleges and universities in ways that no other entity does. And the federal government makes the data publicly accessible. Private data collections are typically voluntary, and so participation is not universal, and the data aren't always made public. And sometimes institutions have to pay to participate in them. That's not to say that these voluntary collections aren't valuable. I think they are an important testing ground for new concepts. For example, we had a number of voluntary initiatives that tested out how to measure Pell graduation rates. And then eventually that was incorporated into NCES collections through some modernization and responsiveness to the field. States also, while they do have robust administrative data systems in many cases, they can't replace the federal collections and compare colleges in different states, because often there are slightly different definitions, slightly different data standards. Data sharing across state lines can be a huge challenge to administer. And then in many states, they don't include all institutions. The state longitudinal data systems don't include private for-profit institutions or private nonprofit institutions. And then finally, the federal government provides a more sustained funding source for this than any private entity could. Philanthropic dollars just don't rise to the same level as federal dollars in terms of sustaining this type of data system. And so that brings me to my last principle here. And that's that we should ground this rebuilding that has to happen. We should reground it in a vision for the depth and the breadth and the scope of the education R&D that our nation truly, truly needs. I think we should be using this moment here to think big about what should happen. And the truth is that right now, IES does its crucial work on a shoestring compared with R&D functions in other industries. In FY24, IES's budget was only $793 million. Within that, NCES's budget was $122 million. Comparatively, NSF funding was 11 times higher at $9 billion, and NIH funding was 60 times higher at $49 billion. Those are also very important research functions, and so is education. Our national future relies on the strength of our education system, and so shouldn't our education decisions be informed by the absolute best data and research available? Imagine what we would accomplish if we were to truly, truly invest in education R&D, invest as if our national health and competitiveness depended on it, because in reality, they do. So as we rebuild, we should not just rebuild what existed before. We should be rebuilding bigger and stronger and with the type of investment that our nation's students truly, truly deserve. So I'm sure there are many, many questions to dive into. Tom, happy to hear what the group has to say and has to ask.
Okay. Mark, I want to come back to you and give you a sort of a tiny, tiny window. I know that's going to be difficult, but just for about 3 minutes. Mamie's laid out a number of things here, actually a number of which you mightn't take objection to, about sort of building back better. Where do we go? What is your vision? Now, I mean, you wrote a piece and it was like, it's easy to kind of knock down the barn. The hard part is building something else, right? So like, seriously, do you have a 3-minute vision of this is where we go?
Well, look, I mean, so I think it's easier for me to articulate what we need in the research side of IES than in the statistics side. So just to clarify something about the statistics side. So Mamie mentioned iPads as a valuable source. You know this data as well as I do. So the problem with iPads is there are many problems with iPads, and some of it is congressional. You know, of course, that okay. So I mean, the College Transparency Act and the whatever the newest version of that is, in fact, and end up creating student-level data systems.
Right, and you and I fought for that.
We fought for this. I mean, I've fought for this for 20-something years already and lost every single time. But the fact of the matter is that the mood is changing, and the fact of the matter is that we may actually end up with the student level data. And as Mamie might say, well, okay, good, but we don't have the resources, the people, or the money to actually implement it. Okay, so this is my problem with iPads. So first of all, when I had the authority to do this, I once asked the iPads team to tell me how many visits, how many people look at every single question in iPads, of which, as you know, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds across 13 different surveys. And no, okay, sorry, I'll ask you, what was the modal category of eyeballs on any question in iPads?
Jessica Shedd is part of this call. I would defer to her.
Well, the answer.
She can write an answer.
The answer is zero. The answer is zero, right? So half of the questions in iPads are I'm sorry, it depends on who's done the study, but let's say about half of the questions in iPads are actually congressionally mandated, okay? And Elise Miller did this thing way back, and then I'm not sure who did the next one, someone at NCES did. So what happens, and this is fundamentally part of the problem with NCES and IHEP, right? So we've had TRPs and twigs, right, about iPads. We've had so many of them that we've had TRPs about the TRPs. And maybe you were the associate commissioner when I met with a bunch of researchers, and I said, hey, look, I know what's going to happen. You're charged with doing, some TRP business. And what you're going to do is you're going to tell me we need more data. And you're going to list every one of these new variables that need to be collected. I said, I don't want you to do that without telling me what goes away. Because the modal category for most things is zero, right? Okay, so they met for 2 days. I went to debrief and I said, okay, where's your list of what you want? And boom, 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 boom. No surprise, it was endless. And then I said, okay, where's the list of what goes away? Null, empty, zero. So part of the problem is we need two things that we need. I mean, look, I was a researcher. I used to be a researcher. I have all the cred for that part, but researchers all they want is more, and the constraints, they don't understand the constraints, and we see this all the time, right? This is incredibly valuable. Well, incredibly valuable for whom and for what purpose? It's just incredibly valuable. I want it. I think you were there too when we finally succeeded in getting rid of a couple, 3 questions in iPads. And the reason that we were able to get rid of them is because the main advocate for them in a university in Pennsylvania died. And it's like, hey, he's dead. We don't have to, because every time in the past when we try to cancel those questions, the guy went to the Senate and and we end up with nasty letters, nasty grants. So iPads is important, but it's overblown. It's too complicated. It is grown what do they say? The house that Jack built. Actually, Jack didn't build it. He inherited it when Jack Buckley became the commissioner. But it's just this massive machine that is old, freaky, and RTI's had the contract for 22 years now.
So I have to speak up in defense of iPads here, Tom.
Yeah. No, I mean, a lot of what iPads did was necessitated by the fact that it didn't have student unit record data, which made it quite, more clunky than it would have needed to be had it had access to student level data.
Right, and we all agree that that's Congress's problem, not.
And that is absolutely.
Right. I'm sorry. As I said, half of that problem is Congress. The other half is internal decision making.
But that's a problem.
Much of the data in the iPads is incredibly useful and used. I think that to the survey that you've done, or the way in which you pulled data on who's viewing the each element. For example, when we use iPads, we download the entire data set and then we work with the various data elements in there. So that wouldn't necessarily show up in that type of of data pull on its usage. Also, these data feed into other tools like the college scorecard, like EdTrust's college results online. It feeds into all of these other places that wouldn't necessarily get picked up there. So I think we need to keep in mind the various ways in which it's used. We also hear from institutions how valuable IPEDS is for their own benchmarking purposes. They're able
Mamie, I'm not saying iPads is not valuable. I'm saying that the fact of the matter is that it is bloated, right? It contains lots of information that is not used. And again, I think every person on this call would agree that a student level data system would be preferable to what we have, right?
Yeah.
But I believe that we're going to get it someday. But again, like Tom and I have been fighting this for 20 years, and you too. But the fact of the matter is that it is an overblown, bloated system.
And while we're having this discussion, people from the Non-Degree Credential Research Network, they are concerned, for example, millions of people, millions of adults are out there acquiring all sorts of other credentials. We need to know a lot more than we do today about the kind of learning that gets acquired and the skills of adult populations. These are falling outside of IPEDS. They're falling outside of most of the work of the federal government. And so, Mark, you were saying earlier, we're kind of standing still and the world is racing ahead. So, what should we do?
To deal with that issue, by the way, I'm going to tell one story, and then I'm going to start with the fact that Matt Siegelman and I at Burning Glass Institute are going to publish a paper and have an event on June the 5th that deals with exactly this issue, right? I mean, so their data is so much better than anything that IPEDS or the federal government has. But let me tell you a story about that. So in part because of all the work that people in this call have been doing with regard to non-degree credentials, I went to OMB and I said, this is happening. We want to add a non-credit data collection. We were turned down. And the reason we were turned down was because, well, IPEDS, the justification for IPEDS is Title IV. And Title IV doesn't cover these activities. So no. And then that is so crazy. So we were able to get approval for a voluntary collection. So you check a box, say, I'll give you these data, but that was never implemented.
Okay.
Yeah, Mark, this is an area where I think we wholeheartedly agree. Like this is the frontier. This is where the field is moving. There's so much happening in the non-degree credential space, and we need better data to be able to understand what's happening there. Because right now we're just kind of flying blind. And Congress is taking action related to short-term credentials, and we need to know what the data are saying about them. So completely agree with you. We need those types of improvements. I think the challenge is that right now, making changes, making improvements to IPEDS or other data systems is sort of off the table because there's no one there to even implement those types of changes that need to happen.
Okay, the sad part is even when there were people there, it wasn't happening. And I mean, I'm not going to, go through chapter and verse of attempts to do this, but the fact of the matter is the interest in the administrative data collection side of NCES was minimal with regard to these data.
Okay. So this would be
minimal,
a time.
by the way, is an overstatement.
Yeah, I mean, I take note of that, Mark, and I saw in your AEI publications, you talked about the desirability of having a scaled up national adult assessment, maybe pulling out of PIOC and having a nationally a larger sample in a household survey of adult learning and skills so that we could get a picture useful for states.
So the lesson there, it comes from NAEP, actually. So NAEP does, I believe that, I mean, look, the trend line is important and maintaining trend is probably overstated, but it is fundamentally important. But the thing that really matters in NAEP is the state-by-state results. Because what that sets off are discussions by governors, right? Why is my state terrible? Why is my, oh, my state is great. And governors, compared to anything the Department of Education has, governors have so much more authority and so much more power. So when, Mississippi, the Mississippi Miracle, Louisiana is now doing the Louisiana Miracle, all these things really end up driving policy. PIAC, I was totally disappointed in PIAC, and you were, I think you were there when, I was the one that got us out of NAL and into PIAC.
Yeah.
And the most recent PIAC, I tried to look at it, and there's 3,100 adults in the sample. You can't do anything with it, right? So I'm totally disappointed in PIAC, and there are many other reasons why. But the fact of the matter is, I think, and maybe this is backwards, maybe it's insular, but I believe that we need to resurrect NAL, or we need to put enough money in PIAC to make a sample of 18, 20,000. But the problem with that is, and we've both been hanging around OECD. I'm not sure if PIAC is the best instrument for the U.S. to, right? So I believe that we probably should go back and do NAL.
Okay.
With sufficient sample to do state-by-state results.
Okay. A provocative question. Given what's happened with the efforts of DOGE to integrate data from across federal data silos that existed because there was a statutory and Privacy Act basis for those, but there are a lot of data being combined in order to that have never been combined before. Is that going to retard efforts, Mark, on the part of Congress to move forward with a rejuvenated student unit record data proposal?
So I'm going to ask, I'll answer it in a couple ways.
It raises concerns.
What?
It raises concerns.
I understand it raises concern. But part of the problem is that our discussion about privacy is incredibly backwards, right? So Amy O'Hara, for example, at the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown, has been having, lots of work and lots of people, lots of panels and lots of discussions about what modern privacy protection looks like. So FERPA was 1974, I think, but is sometime in the early 70s. And it was based on what we had then, right? But the fact of the matter is that privacy protection technology or privacy enhancing technology, PET, has gotten so much more sophisticated, which of course it's a dual-edged sword, right? We have the capacity for protecting data, but we also have the capacity for, as you say, integrating tons and tons of data that have never been integrated before. So that's clearly the case. But here, this is the part that that I've been pushing for a long time with little success, is that the right way to think about these data and the merging of these data is a benefit cost analysis, right? When we merge these data, we're not merging them for fun. We're merging them for particular policy purposes or research purposes or whatever. So there are benefits that accrue from merging these data. So the easiest examples have to do with SLDS, for example, right? That now has data that goes to early childhood through post-secondary, through labor force. And that's merging tons of data from different data sets that were never merged previously. And then the vision of SLDS is we start bringing in other data, housing data, social welfare data, all this kind of stuff. And what we would end up is like a 360 view of a student's progress, a student's problems, et cetera. The easiest example to get your head around is absenteeism, right? So the causes of absenteeism are many. And if we don't know what's leading to that chronic absenteeism, we're blind. So the question is, what is the benefit and what are the causes? of combining these data. The privacy hawks, which have dominated for so long, said there's no, I mean, literally, there's no benefit. Maybe literally is too strong a word, but there is, there's no benefit to merging these data. And all there is risks for disclosure, etc. Well, I mean, that's wrong. We need a much more sophisticated discussion of what the benefits are and what the costs are. And then we have to, and then this is Congress's role. They're the ones that have to set, like, okay, we can live with this, or we can't live with this, or yes, we need these pets, these privacy enhancing technologies to keep the balance better, or to make sure that the benefits go up without the risk swamping them.
Yeah, I think that that point about Congress is an important one. This is the issue of privacy protections has long been a bipartisan issue. It's something Republicans care about. It's something Democrats care about, and we need to make sure that our legislation both is upheld, legislation that is on the books is upheld, and that future legislation prioritizes privacy and security in addition to data access and data connections. We can have a both end here. But I think that to your question, Tom, like the bigger picture here is around how to do this. What are the appropriate ways to connect data, and what are the inappropriate ways to do it? Because there's a right way to do this and there's a wrong way to do it. And the wrong way is to pull a bunch of PII into a black box, use it for a bunch of unidentified purposes, including sharing it with undisclosed parties and without legal authority, and acting in haste, the way that we've seen DOJ has been acting on a number of issues. The right way to do it is to use that sensitive data in deliberate, thoughtful ways, having robust, transparent governance structures, gathering stakeholder input on how the data are being used, setting clear priorities about how the data are going to be used, and having those strong privacy and security safeguards in there, as well as consequences for misuse of the data. So we can have those good governance structures and build data connections, data matches that are used for good, strong, legitimate purposes, while avoiding doing it in this haphazard way that is a real risk of the current environment.
Yeah, I'm worried about the capacity of Congress, to be perfectly frank, to handle these questions with sensitivity and wisdom. We have a question someone has asked us, and I'm not sure that I have no capacity to answer it. One of the questions is data reporting. iPads collection is continuing. Are there data actually going to be released from iPads? My answer to that is I don't know. Do you know, Mamie? Do you know, Mark, whether they're going to manage to collect and release data as they've done in past?
I have real concerns about how that's going to happen. I mean, we're all relying upon it to happen, but if they don't have any people there to do it, I'm deeply concerned.
So the department made a fundamental mistake, and they know it, right? So I mean, many people in this call know that I've been not distraught over some of the actions of that have trimmed, shall we say, decimated. No, decimated means that 1/10 got fired. What's super decimated, where only 10% remained? The department knows that they have to stand up and start saying, this is our plan, this is what we're going to do. The mistake that they made was unleashing DOJ without standing up and saying, we're getting rid of stuff that needed to be gotten rid of, but here's the plan. Give us 30 days, give us 60 days, whatever it is. They needed to be able to stand up and say, this is not just destruction. This is not just putting a big hole in the ground, right? This is the fact that we're laying a foundation for much stronger IHEP and NCES. And the failure of them to stand up and do that, I think they know it's a failure, and I'm still hoping that they will actually, stand up and say, this is what we're doing.
That's we've run out of time. That's actually a really good note on which to end our discussion. And do you have any? Do any of us in this have any idea of when that is? That in the offing, Mark?
Soon.
Okay. So if we come together, say in September, there will be a vision of where we're going.
I certainly hope so.
Okay. All right. Great. You'll be responsible if not.
I think so.
Michelle, are you here?
Yeah, I am
There
here.
you are. Well, I think we've reached the end of our allotted time.
I think so. I think so. It's been really a great discussion. Thank you for moderating, and Mamie and Mark, thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights with us. Thanks everyone for being here. Hopefully we'll see everyone soon at our conference at the end of May.
Okay. Thank you,
Take care.
and I hope to continue the discussion in the autumn.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye then.